Armors. I participated in an educational experience as a teacher at the psychiatric hospital Borda, in which art bridged the gap between subjective visual constructions and words. Art was presented like a bailout, relating that which linked the inside to the outside. I began to acknowledge the degree of vulnerability that those people were under, and following this, to produce a series of objects related to nature. By generating a violent-looking texture with epoxy clay, a kind of paleontological armor was displayed on the wall, ready to protect us. This series was made in 2000. Paradoxes. Later on, the feelings of being unprotected was transferred to the domestic realm, where everyday furniture became functionless by being covered with a second skin of thorns, made of epoxy clay in place of an individual, touching on the seriously deep economic and social crisis in Argentina in those days. Home Sweet Home. This piece was produced in 2001, in the midst of a period of sheer panic post 9/11 in New York, while in Argentina a severe collapse of the political system resulted in 4 presidencies within a month. Home Sweet Home cast an ironic eye on the surrounding fear. The house, our world, at that time was far from a peaceful shelter. A house covered with jagged carnivorous plants, which attacked us and became ominous. This series meant to prompt a reflection on radical paradigm shifts worldwide. Bunker. The bunker installation was created amidst several social and economic crises after 2001. The cartoneros emerged as a labor resource for survival, while a substantial number of homeless people sought refuge in the streets. I produced this installation, which consisted of a living room where all the elements in it were covered with an organic texture full of spikes, made of epoxy clay, in a state of alertness and fear, as a metaphor for that moment of withdrawal and solitude. Meanwhile, the media distanced us from reality. Shadows. Once again, violence reappeared in Shadows, 2004, produced during my artist in residency at Artelecu in the Basque Country, as a result of my looking over the fierce complaints in which truck fires were burnt on roads all over Argentina. In Spain, an increasing atmosphere of violence was tangible prior to the terrorist attacks at the Atocha station in Madrid. Thus, in my work, I covered certain elements for domestic use, namely a chair with tire rubber, producing a dark, monstrous skin that wrapped it all up. In this way, certain shifts in terms of use and stabilization were created, as the chair rested on a mirror. Fragility. In 2006, I took part in an art residency at the Sculpture Space in New York. During my residency in New York, I made an installation called Behind the Apparent and a photographic series, The House as a Threat. I considered the city as the setting for condensed fears violence, uncertainty, and fragility. I collected elements for domestic use from the streets, which I camouflaged by means of interventions using industrial materials. Then I photographed abandoned domestic objects exposed to extreme situations, as if the house had been overturned. In these pieces, I used furniture as a substitute for an individual, which was eventually linked as a bare or violated body to an estrangement. I connected these works to a new series of photographs taken in the Edinburgh Cemetery in 2010, onto which I applied, via hammer blows, intervened methacrylate only partially. Also in 2013, I presented my solo show, Fragility. The Symbolic House. On April 2nd, 2013, the city of La Plata was tragically flooded, causing severe damage and many casualties due to irresponsible state administration mismanagement. La Plata Urban Project dates back to 1882, designed as an ideal city, in which Freemasonry and its symbols played a fundamental role, reflected in the city layout. Such elements as the compass and the square embodied the ideals of progress. In my work, I carry out a dual operation. I rescue photos from the Foundation archives, which I crop and overlap, recovering the symbols of power from oblivion. I intervene in photographs of state palaces, applying an acrylic surface thinned by hammer blows. As a consequence, I intend to expose the cracks of a wrecked political system. Crosses in the Rio de la Plata. I became mainly focused on the project concerning the Piria Palace in Punta Lara and the Piria Palace in Montevideo, situated on both sides of the Rio de la Plata coast, within the cultural fabric interlaced between Argentina and Uruguay. In a typically 20th century utopia, Francisco Piria, an Uruguayan businessman and politician, lived in both buildings and dreamt of creating an ideal area, the golden region of the Rio de la Plata. I am interested in developing a dated as well as an ongoing dialogue between both coasts. The existent conditions of both palaces bring about an overwhelming contrast. While the one in Punta Lara, Argentina, is almost in ruins, the Uruguayan counterpart belongs to the national heritage. In fact, the palace houses today the Supreme Court of Justice. My resources involve photographic montage in the form of fragments and construction debris transformed into installations. Architectural collapse and ruin allude to the failures of modern utopias, battered by economic crisis and lack of solid cultural strategies. As for the river, it comprises a fundamental iconic role in the dialogue between both margins.